Hello, hello. Thank you all for joining us. I have the pleasure of introducing our Tuesday night lecture speaker this evening, DMA's own Chelsea Thompto. Chelsea Thompto is a transdisciplinary artist and educator working at the intersection of art, trans studies, and technology. She's an assistant professor of digital media art and the digital media art and art history at San José State University and serves on the board of directors of the new Media Caucus and the editorial board of Media N, Journal of the New Media Caucus. She received an MFA and MA in 4D art, an MA in gender and women's studies from the University of Wisconsin Madison, and has shown her work nationally and internationally. I'm very pleased to present Chelsea Thompto in her first lecture to the San Jose State body, a public lecture after her hiring. So it's been almost exactly a year since your last visit with us virtually. I thank you again for your presence here, and I'm looking very forward to your talk. Chelsea, if you don't mind just kind of telling the audience how you'd like us to proceed, and I'm happy to help moderate Q&A at the end, however you'd like to manage that.
Sure, great, thank you. And thank you for the introduction. I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. I have a title slide and then some programming things, which I'll include that as well. So just a second here. Just getting chat set up. All right, so in the chat, you will find links, and I will post them again periodically as more people enter. The very first link there is to the slide presentation that you'll see. But before I get too much into that, I did just want to start with a land acknowledgement. So for me, it's been a great, exciting pleasure to move to the Bay Area and move back to California. And part of that for me is starting to understand the history of this place. And so the great folks over in the diversity, equity, and inclusion section of our campus, together with the Indian Health Center and Mwekma Ohlone Tribe, have put together this statement, a land acknowledgement, which I wanted to read to you all to start. So I acknowledge that the land on which I'm speaking to you from today is the traditional home of the Puichuan Ohlone speaking people and the present day Mwekma Ohlone tribe. The Puichuan Ohlone were missionized into both missions Dolores and Santa Clara, and the present day Mwekma Ohlone tribe is comprised of all known surviving Native American lineages aboriginal to the San Francisco Bay region who trace their ancestry through the missions San Jose, Santa Clara, and Dolores, and the historic federally recognized Verona Band of Alameda County. In the Mwekma Ohlone language, Cocheño, Mwekma means the people. Without them, I would not have access to this gathering, and I want to take this opportunity to thank the original caretakers of this land. All right, so before I get started, I wanted to place this link here as well. So this is the same in the chat, but if for some reason the device you're on, you can't see the chat, I wanted to make sure it was here as well. In addition, I wanted to take this moment to also state that there are numerous videos throughout the slides. However, none of these videos contain sound. So the only sound that you'll be hearing throughout the presentation is my voice. So when you see video, if you don't hear sound, that is a-okay. They're all actually embedded GIFs. So I wanted to get that out of the way so that people weren't worried that they might be missing something. All right, so tonight I am really excited to be talking to you about my newest project, Landmarks. It's a continuation of a body of research started really, it's really kind of, it stems from the heart of all of the artwork that I've made in the last 10 years, but a more clarified idea that has coalesced around a nice crystalline research statement has formed in the last 2 years or so. And this is the first project here at San Jose State. And this, what you see here is a screenshot. To be unknowable to a system may be as liberating as it is dangerous. So I also wanted to start here with this synthetic image. So what we see in front of us is not a face that is associated with a human body. It is a face that has been generated by a generative adversarial neural network, which is basically a machine learning system that took 70,000 human faces, high resolution from Flickr, and created a methodology by which to produce quote unquote new faces. And so what you see is actually a composite image. It is then animated by another machine learning system. This one usually meant to animate old photographs on myheritage.com. And then on top of that is facial recognition machine learning, which is what places the landmarks, the gender, and the emotion. And so we have these three layers of machine learning, artificial intelligence in conversation with one another. And that's what a lot of what I'll be focusing on tonight in terms of the technological side of things is engaging with these technologies from a critical lens. So to start, I'm a research-based transdisciplinary artist, and my research is situated at the intersection of art, trans studies, and technology. As an artist, my practice moves across and through materials and technologies and is driven by questions drawn from the embodied experience of being trans, working both from my lived experience and academic research. The question at the heart of my research is, in the contemporary gender war, and in particular, its multi-sided transaction through the field of the visual, how do the differently pitched envisionments and enactments impact trans bodies? Furthermore, what role does technology play in creating said envisionments and facilitating said enactments? Within this framework, I'm particularly interested in interrupting and interrogating the ways trans bodies are violently categorized through technologies, and to instead explore how technology might be leveraged in service of trans liberation, as well as the expanding and collapsing of the categories of gender, body, and human more broadly. And my practice is about questioning rather than asking questions rather than answering them. It's invested in criticism, speculation, and experimentation. I want to go back again to this phrase, research-based transdisciplinary artist, and focus now on this idea of trans, which at its most basic means across, beyond, and through. This is enacted in my practice in multiple ways, as gesture, as form, as identity, as method. Thinking here about methods, I want to outline now some of the ways in which I am thinking about the work that I do. I will then talk a little bit about the materials and mediums that I engage with, and then talk about the thematics of this project, and will then outline how those thematics link up to prior projects. So I'm interested in fascination, transing, archiving, creating and manipulating systems, material specificity, layering, and archival research, and visual cultural analysis. I work across a variety of media, including digital image making, digital fabrication, creative coding, writing, printmaking, bookbinding, and other sculptural processes. Tonight, I'm going to be focusing on the following 5 thematics, that is trans visibility, non-linearity, digital material specificity, bodies and technology, and surveying/surveillance. To formulate a framework around which to understand this work, in 2018, I drafted and have been continually revising what I'm calling the Transcode Manifesto. And I want to speak for just a moment about why I wrote this. So I write and theorize about the work that I make because as a trans woman, I am all too familiar with people applying their narratives and values to my body and to my labor. And so the gesture and the idea behind the Transcode work is to create a framework for understanding and producing work from a trans perspective. As a living document, the Transcode Manifesto informs and is informed by my studio practice. Investing in the possibilities posed by a theoretical combination of trans and code, The Transcode Manifesto explores how these ideas can be leveraged within a transdisciplinary art practice. Transcode work is at its core refuses a linear understanding of narrative, time, knowledge making, and labor. The version of the manifesto that you are reading is the first version, the rough draft, as well as the third or fourth versions whose changes are, were, will be relatively minor or possibly cataclysmic. It is at the same time the final and most definitive edition. This is because transcode work, at its core, refuses linear understandings of narrative, time, knowledge making, and labor. Instead, transcode work insists upon lingering in the ebb and flow between categories, definitions, and destinations, to see the many iterations and tangents of a work as inseparable from its final product and potentially inscrutable to the logic of cause and effect. How might an end have affected its own beginning? In the formulation A to B, transcode invests in the liberatory power of the two as a space of movement, possibility, and rupture. Transcode examines code as a base material in culture's generation of meaning and narrative. Code, meaning a system of signals or symbols for communication, as well as a system of principles and instructions for a computer. Transcode then is an interruption of and transversal between codes, an effort to place oneself at the site of meaning making, exposing the codes, structures, processes, and laws, which undergird supposedly inherent truths of gender, of ownership, of land. Transcode is numerously trans, meaning it enacts and explores trans in its subjects, methods, and themes and forms. Transcode work, while stemming from an interrogation of transgender issues, seeks to hold space for other, emerging, and multiple trans identity configurations. Transcode work is transmaterial, meaning its projects engage a variety of forms which may shift over time. Transcode work sees and responds to the violences of codes, taxonomies, and categorical systems. Transcode work is expansive in its understanding of bodies and sees bodyhood as a gesture of recontextualizing subjects and conceiving of the body as surpassing the corporeal. Transcode work engages systems, computer, numerical, political, and etc., as a way of critically interrogating oppression and control. Transcode work takes up codes as an artistic material and as a trans methodology. While not only referring to computer code, transcode views computer code as a material with immense potential in enacting the gesture of trans. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to talk through the 5 thematics, linking them to prior work, and then move on to actually talking about the Landmarks project, where I see all of these themes coalescing. So to start, I want to talk about trans visibility. We are living in a time of trans visibility, yet we are also living in a time of anti-trans violence. This is from the volume Trapdoor, which seeks to articulate the very complicated ways in which trans people have tried to and continue to try to navigate the politics of visibility, especially as trans cultural producers. So for me, this all really can be understood through this idea of the fiduciary identity, which comes from Standy Stone's The War of Desire and Technology at the Close of the Mechanical Age. Retaining the same name throughout life is part of an evolving strategy of producing particular kinds of subjects. In order to stabilize a name in such a way that it becomes a permanent descriptor, its function must either be split off from the self, or else the self must acquire a species of obduracy and permanence to match that of the name. In this manner, a permanent name facilitates control, enhances interchangeability. If you can't have a symbolic identity, name, that coincides with your actual state at the time, then your institutionally maintained or fiduciary identity speaks you. You become the generic identity that institutional descriptors allow. And this really gets to the heart of this matter of visibility that trans people find themselves within. It is a context in which we are striving to make ourselves knowable while also trying to avoid the violences that sometimes come with being known. An example of this can be found in the ways in which governments try to regulate the way that sex and gender are defined on government documents. And so this here comes from the most recent guidance from my home state of Iowa for how to change the gender on your birth certificate. So first, I would have to obtain a legal name change if desired, and then obtain an affidavit from my treating physician stating that my sex designation has been permanently changed by surgery or other treatment, and then obtain an amendment of Iowa Certificate of Birth from the Iowa Department of Public Health, locate or obtain a current government issued picture ID, and submit the application and supporting documents. And what fascinates me about this is really, it comes down to number two, this idea that a treating physician would have to write a letter. And this has to be on official letterhead, and it has to really particularly outline the processes that you have gone through in order to quote unquote prove to the state of Iowa that your birth certificate should be changed. And this really, when we look at this list, we can also think about taxpayer money, right? We can think about the labor of a government institution, the number of people that have to interact with you and with these documents in order to verify why, right? Why must all of this labor be expended to make stable my gender identity and to make it validated throughout a system? This can be further understood through what I'm sure many of you are familiar with in the backscanner machine at airports. What we see here is one of the standard ones that you will find across many airports in the United States, the user interface of which is here. There's a really brilliant and beautiful narrative and critical analysis of this process done in the book Design Justice, linked here at the bottom. But one thing I want to highlight here is that this is the user interface that TSA agents actually see. And what they do is they gaze through that machine and they look at you, and then they make a choice to scan you as either blue or pink. And based on that, the machine will calibrate what it sees as an acceptable body mass and configuration for a given gender. The important things here are that the TSA agent looking at you through this machine doesn't have your documents in front of you. They are simply making a visual judgment and making a categorization choice based on their own preconceptions. And of course, that decision is being made in this very binary way. There are only two choices. So for many folks who step into this machine, they will find that their body does not, in fact, match within a statistically acceptable range of being male or female. And this is for those that do not identify as trans as well as those that do, right? We can see things like a person's weight or their ability status as impacting their ability to quote unquote pass as a given gender in these machines. So when I'm thinking about this work and I'm thinking about this issue, I'm really thinking about not just my embodied experience of moving through these systems, but then looking back and seeing how the way that those systems actually try to see me can tell me something about them, right? So why is that machine calibrated to only male or female? Why are there so many steps in me trying to change my gender on my birth certificate? All of these things, to me, seem to indicate a investment in the state in creating these fiduciary subjects, which Sandy Sohn talked about, this interchangeable, knowable, definable, categorizable subjects that are easy to govern, easier to control. And so we can see the trans body then as a problem to these systems, a thorn really in the side. It makes it very, very challenging when a body does not want to align or conform to a static state over time. So part of this work was also involved some writing about this very issue. writing which in one of the installations became text on the wall. Trans bodies have been made navigable for contemporary culture. They are leveraged by all sides of the political and cultural spectrum to define the boundaries of what they believe and how they see the future. What would it mean for a trans body to become unnavigable, useless, merely a part of the landscape? Here we have an excerpt from a supercut video. Usually it has sound, but I actually sort of love the visual of it without sound. But this I made in 2018, and it is supercuts of national news using the word transgender. And so here I'm interested in actually pulling out the moment where the idea of transness is conjured in these news moments and compiling these snapshots and starting to think about all of the ways that trans bodies are texted upon and visualized rather. So next I want to talk about nonlinearity. Refuse closure, insist on situation, seek multiplicity. This is the response that Sandy Stone gave during the 2016 Trans Studies Conference in Arizona when asked by a participant of the conference, how do people actually do trans studies? And so this became a really animating idea for me in my work, was to think about what is an art form that refuses closure, that insists on situation, and that seeks multiplicity. And for me, this idea of nonlinearity really gets to the heart of that. So I again return to this idea from the Transcode Manifesto, that is, in the formulation of A to B, Transcode invests in the liberatory power of two as a space of movement, possibility, and rupture. So in 2016, after having written a thesis, I had started to think about this idea of text and the ways in which text was failing to render what I wanted it to render. And so I took this rather standard thesis that I had written, and I built a very simple Markov chain generating program that let me put in my thesis, and it would spit out these sentences which had torn up parts of my own writing and then built up new sentences and spit them out over and over again. And this became part of a studio practice wherein I really began to use code as a way of creating an intellectual gesture, as a way to think through some of these intangible ideas. But more than just from a coding standpoint, I've also been very interested in this idea of nonlinearity through storytelling and other methods. So this is one of my first attempts at creating a nonlinear artist book. The book that you see here uses a radially designed accordion fold, and I'll actually talk a little bit more about the materiality of it in a little bit. But the idea here to create something nonlinear was then extended into this question of what would a book look like if the spine was a point rather than a line? So I set about actually trying to make that real. So what would happen if a book was orbiting around a central point rather than rotating around a line? I designed this structure here. You can see another view of it here. And then actually produce that into physical objects in order to bind books that were comprised of multiple nodes. You can see that here. With each installation of this work, I'm able to revise the number of nodes, where the pages exist, how they work with one another. And it is, again, a way for me to try to think through this idea of creating a space for the viewer to explore without guiding them to a strict or heavy-handed political idea or singular answer to the questions that I'm raising. So you can see it again here in relation to some of the text. Next, I want to talk about digital material specificity and material specificity in general. So again, back to the artist book I talked about here. So this book is digitally printed, but each page is fully coated front and back with beeswax, meaning that when viewers engage with the book, it was impossible for them not to begin to destroy it by adding their fingerprints and their fingernail markings to it. That same beeswax was treated onto the table, the surface of the table that we see here, as well as manufacturing the table itself to have the pocket that we see that the book lands on top of. In this, I'm interested in implicating the viewer in this process of seeing, right? They can't look at this book, they can't matriculate through the book without implying that they did so by marring its surface. And so I'm interested in here both in the specificity of the form of a book and the intimacy of that process, as well as the materiality of beeswax, its fragility, the slight stickiness and tackiness of it, and the way that it remembers touch. Similarly, when I'm thinking about the digital materials that we flow through every day, I'm also interested in exploring new media forms in the way in which they were originally designed and manipulating those systems. So what we see here is another video excerpt from my show Cite, Cite, Cite. In this, I asked a question to Google, and then when you ask a question to Google, it will ask if you want to look at more questions similar to that question. And what I simply did was continue to ask for more questions related to the question, which at the time of doing this was unlimited. You could just continually ask for more questions and it would expand and create this nearly infinite list, all based off the idea of what is transgender. And this is what came of it after hundreds of questions. And so here, I'm thinking about how can I actually visualize, think through, understand the material of this questioning algorithm. Similarly, I'm also interested in the visual languages that we move through. In this case, I was thinking about the idea of seals. Seals are usually stand-ins for government power, whether that's the seal of a king or a queen, or the seal of a state or a county or a people. And so in this, I actually rendered seals, but for an event. And in this case, it was seals that represented the murder of all trans people in the United States in 2016, with an effort towards creating a seal that usually stands in for power, that represented a moment where a person was completely disempowered by their state, by their context. I then went ahead and rendered those in a variety of forms, including as glass wax facsimiles. So just like you might see a wax seal on an envelope, I created the same thing, but out of solid blown glass, allowing both for a durable material that people could pick up, but also the translucency, which resists in some ways being able to see and understand the material embedded on the glass without picking it up and having a tactile experience with it. This also informs the way in which I install video work. Here we can see a back projected video that is reflecting off of tiled walls. These are all considerations that I make in the installation of the work. How do I want viewers' bodies to be in association with the work? How do I want the luminosity of a screen or of a projection to impact the work that I'm making and viewing? Next, briefly, I want to talk about bodies and technology. Of course, in my most recent project, as I'm going to talk about with AI, this is a lot more about the way technology is applied to a body. But in this project, A Transmaterial Body from 2018, which is ongoing, I was thinking about the boundaries of the self and thinking about ways that technology might actually be used to complicate the boundaries of the body, and to think about ways in which we could use network technology to expand the physical self into a digital space through this creative reappropriation. So the piece basically takes a small Raspberry Pi with some environmental sensors on it that are also connected to a heart rate monitor that I wear on my body at all times during the performance. The website itself, oh, my video is not playing. I'm going to go ahead and, here we go. The wireless network that is generated from the Raspberry Pi produces a login video, much like we see here, where viewers can come and talk to me, after which they can log in and they can see a live version of my heart rate being put out through the website. So in this, the network name is Chelsea Thompto, as my name is Chelsea Thompto, and my heart rate is being put out on that network. And as the network is overlapped with my body at all times and shares my name and has my biological data, it is a poetic gesture in trying to reassert that the body might in fact not just end where our skin ends. Finally, I want to talk about this idea of surveying and surveillance. So this is a river chronology from a brochure of the Mississippi River produced by the Army Corps of Engineers in the 1940s. I want to just focus in on one thing here, which is the 1670 is the start of this river chronology. French explorers Hennepin and Marquette and Joliet opened the Mississippi to the white man, capital W, capital M, from 1670 to 1730. This is important because it actually, for me, encapsulates a lot of the problematics of mapping and technology in Western culture, in that we often don't see something as existing until we have seen it, right? The Mississippi cannot have a chronology until the white man has gazed upon it. And this really starts to encapsulate some of the problematics that get embedded and encoded into the systems that we have to deal with every day. So maps are not only renderings of a geographical area, but can also map the desires and goals of their funders and makers. Further, these desires and goals can be transmitted along with the geographic information as maps are circulated. This leads me to Productive Bodies, the most recent body of work before coming here to SJSU. Productive Bodies explores transgender identity in relation to questions of visualization as violence, technology in relation to the body, and how we conceive of the boundaries of the self. You have seen parts of this work throughout the presentation already, from the text and book. These are some details from that book. This is from the nonlinear book, as well as projected video, which we see here. All right, so now I'm going to talk about landmarks, what I've been doing since I've been here. This question, how does the algorithm see me, is really at the core of this research. So this work is part of a larger body of research considering the role modeling has played in medical, scientific, computational, and military projects aimed at categorizing and developing subjects inherently resistant to fixity, trans people, landscapes, and etc. Landmarks is the first project of this research focus to be produced during my time here at SJSU. Landmarks was made possible in part by a residency this winter at Laboratory Arts Plus Residency in Spokane, Washington. Part of this broader research was included in a collaboration with artists Ben Gillis and Farhad Baram, which we presented at the 2021 CAA conference, and which will also be presented virtually this summer at the AdArt conference in Barcelona, Spain. Landmarks is an exploration of the ways artificial intelligence, and specifically facial recognition, failed to comprehend bodies, misgendering, and the threat this failure poses to trans livelihood as these technologies become increasingly integrated into our daily lives. The work consists of an interactive website featuring compositions that explore these issues. Landmarks asks us to consider how technology sees us and what happens when it fails to see us for who we really are. Landmark, noun, a prominent or conspicuous object on the land that serves as a guide, especially to ships at sea or to travelers on the road, a distinguishing landscape feature marking a site or location. The post office served as a landmark for locating the street to turn down. 2, something used to mark the boundary of land. Body as land. This gets back to this idea of survey surveillance. Again, maps are not only renderings of a geographical area, but can also map the desires and goals of their funders and makers. Further, these desires and goals can be transmitted along with the geographic information as maps are circulated. Code as medium, written in HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. The site makes use of the library faceapi.js for in-browser, webcam, and still image facial recognition. Excuse me. The site itself is under constant construction and revision, while also being open for viewing and engagement as it grows and takes on new forms, content, and ideas. The intention here is to invite viewers into the act of coding and to resist static form. This constant revision and evolution can also be understood as performance art through the medium of code. Return again to this synthetic image, which draws upon many of the technologies which I will be highlighting here in a moment. So what I'd like to do now, with my time remaining, is to do a walkthrough of the site itself. Again, I will paste one more time in the chat the links. If you go to landmarks.glitch.me, that is the link to the actual site. I am plagued by a question. As a trans person, is it better to be seen accurately or not seen at all? How does the algorithm see me? How does it guess what I'm feeling? Is there such a thing as a neutral expression? Can it tell the difference between a smile caused by a joke or one that masks rage? Do I want it to be able to tell the difference? To be unknowable to a system may be as liberating as it is dangerous. Empire, a map of this data body larger than itself. In that empire, the art of cartography attained such perfection that the map of a single province occupied the entirety of a city. The map of the empire, the entirety of a province. In time, those unconscionable maps no longer satisfied, and the cartographers' guilds struck a map of the empire whose size was that of the empire, in which coincided point for point with it. The following generations, who were not so fond of the study of cartography as their forebears had been, saw that that vast map was useless. And not without some pitilessness was it that it was delivered up to the inclemencies of sun and winter. In the deserts of the West, still today, there are tattered ruins of the map, inhabited by animals and beggars. In all the land, there is no other relic of the disciplines of cartography. And that's Suarez Miranda, Vallejas de Varones Prudentes, Libro 4, Cap 45, Lierda, 1658. And that is On Exactitude in Science by Jorge Luis Borges from Collected Fictions, translated by Andrew Hurley. The stakes are different for my body, the body of a trans woman, a body upon which so many claims are being made and remade. Bodies are screens on which we see projected the momentary settlements that emerge from ongoing struggles over beliefs and practices within the academic and medical communities. These struggles play themselves out in arenas far removed from the body. The Empire Strikes Back, a post-transsexual manifesto, Sandy Stone. Stages. Discover, map, define, exploit. Each step is less about the body and more about what can be extracted from it. Machine. Facial landmark rules. Brows, 5 points and 4 lines each. Eyes, 6 points and 6 lines each. Nose, 9 points and 8 lines. 4 points from bridge to tip of nose, 5 points from left to right nostril. Lips, 20 points and 20 lines. 5 points, 10 points from upper lip, 10 points from lower lip. For each lip, 5 points on outer edge, 3 points on inner edge, corners overlap. Jaw, 17 points and 16 lines, 8 per side, ending at the ear. This is how the system maps and labels the features of the face. Under this system, my face is recognized with maximum confidence of only 89% across 9 angles. In one image, my face is not recognized at all. In the others, my gender is incorrectly and confidently reported at a high of 95% confidence and a low of 62. How can I convince this machine of my gender? How can I communicate something that is the sum of so many little moments, gestures, and decisions? The relative lightness of my skin serves to make me more legible to facial recognition software, as studies have shown that these technologies often fail to accurately recognize dark-skinned faces. Yet as this technology, calibrated to whiteness, gazes upon my face, I am still misgendered. As these technologies are finding their way into the hands of law enforcement, I am left thinking about how trans people of color are multiply threatened by the intersection of this transphobic and racist tech with transphobic and racist policing. Consider another set of faces. None of these faces belong to a human body. They are generated by another algorithm, specifically a generative adversarial network, trained on 70,000 faces and tasked with creating new ones. They are composite images, an assembly of textures, shapes, and colors gathered into formations according to the algorithm's rules for what constitutes a face. What happens when we point one algorithm at another? Facial landmark rules. What are they saying to each other? In their conversation, the composite faces are more legible than my own. They see each other with greater clarity and certainty. They can agree on what a face is and place it into specific emotional and gender categories. Wrote, how do we know a body is a body, a face a face? A question many tech companies are working tirelessly to automate an answer to, upon which futures are being built and decided and bought. Yet we perform this task day in and day out on screens and in person, passively placing people and things into categories. A task so rote, it is difficult to imagine it as a task at all. What happens if we ourselves face this task as we have programmed machines to face it, isolating the problem and giving it rules, facial landmark rules, and then applying those rules? As before, the face below does not belong to a human body. It was created using an algorithm, specifically a generative adversarial network, trained on 70,000 faces and tasked with creating new ones. Brows, 5 points and 4 lines each. Eyes, 6 points and 6 lines each. Nose, 9 points and 8 lines, 4 points from bridge to tip of nose, 5 points from left to right nostril. Lips, 20 points and 20 lines, 10 points for upper lip, 10 points for lower lip. For each lip, 5 points on the outer edge, 3 points on inner edge, corners overlap. Jaw, 17 points and 16 lines, 8 per side, ending at the ear. What makes a face, a body, a body? Is this face less real because it was made by a machine? Why? Is it a face or not? Is it male or female? Is it happy, sad, neutral, angry, fearful, disgusted, or surprised? Who chooses and encodes these categories? How do we know by rote that a body is a body and a face a face? So that's the end of my talk. I want to thank you all for showing up. I'm excited to answer any questions that you have. And again, here are the links.
Thank you, Chelsea. Round of applause. Would you prefer, I think we have a group where people can unmute and ask their questions.
Yeah, that works.
Great. So if you have questions for Chelsea, you can either type them into the chat, or if you want to, just go ahead and unmute yourself when there's an opening. And I think we're a small enough group, we can kind of manage that. I'm happy to read off the chat as well. And I also do have some questions, but I want to open it up for Andrew and Craig. If you, I'm happy to start off, but I just.
Yeah, I have questions. Craig, do you want to go first, or do you want me?
Let's do rock, paper, scissors.
Okay.
Okay,
One,
1, 2, 3.
That was paper. What were you, scissors?
Okay, I did scissors. Okay, I'll go first. Thank you, Chelsea, for your talk. The work is very transdisciplinary, working across different medium and materials, code and concepts. One of the things that I notice about the work is that it's also very transparent, open, and well documented. You provide your source code, and you make this work very available. In fact, the landmark piece really is almost at the tool building stage of intervention. Like any open source code, it's also very community oriented. And Transcode Manifesto, you seek to hold space for other emerging and multiple trans identity configurations, allowing that shift over time. And then the one that really piqued my interest was the response to violences of codes, taxonomies, and categorical systems. So my question is as follows, it's a two-parter. As an educator, how do you see the role of trans studies and open source pedagogy, or if you have another term for that, and working with students who often find themselves in a liminal space, kind of between worlds of identity and with technology, virtuality and materiality and the real. And then secondly, and kind of related, but even more so for maybe faculty, I hate to make this such a university focused question, but how do you navigate systems which do in fact reinforce codes, taxonomies, and systems like code itself in academia, but also are the path towards liberation from those systems? And yeah, so one other thing that piqued my interest in this question was this comment, how do we point one algorithm at another? So I hope that helps to book in the question.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. I think that, for me, when it comes to the idea of pedagogy, it's pretty fascinating because I've been thinking about this idea of open source in relation to the conversation that's been happening around NFTs, right? And this idea of creating digital scarcity. And I see open source as a sort of other side of that coin. There is some complexities to that though, because there is a privilege in being able to engage in an open source process, right? Like an open source process is one that also means that you are probably in a position, such as I am here at an institution, where I have support otherwise that allows me to actually create that work in such an open way and not be concerned about needing to monetize parts of my labor. And so for me, I really do see it as both a community building tool, wanting to bring other trans folks into the conversation around technology, but then also to be able to share that perspective with other educators and be able to, open up and be very much transparent in how I'm actually, how this work is actually being made, for me is part of what I became a professor to do. My goals in becoming a professor, on top of course, teaching, were to really be able to develop these kind of theories and these ideas outside the requirement that I immediately monetize them in order to make myself solvent as a human being. And so that's part of the joy, I think, really of being here and being able to work in this digital media realm. In terms of navigating a system, I think that part of it for me is, when it really comes to the code, is this idea that I didn't show this piece during the talk tonight, but I made a piece in 2015 where I created a replacement for the alphabet that uses dash symbols that are this way or this way. In fact, I have it tattooed on myself here. It's a little hard to see. There it is. And part of that was about this idea of thinking about the binary, the 0 and the 1, is really about the absence or presence of electricity, right? And when we really get down to this idea of absence or presence in electricity, it is actually much more murky, and it's much less clear. And so for me, part of that, the joy of building systems out of code that are resistant to this linearity, really, I think, gets to the heart of what the potential for code is, which is to really, for me in my practice, is to model and make visible and visceral the sort of theoretical, philosophical ideas that are floating around in my studio that are impossible to work with otherwise. An example of this is that when I'm making sculpture, much of the time, I look at it and I say, man, I wish that this could levitate. I wish that in a gallery, this could just float off the ground and be, this impossible object in the air. And I think that code has allowed me to make some of those impossible objects in a way that I haven't been able to find otherwise. So I don't know if that answers all your questions, but
it answers them well enough. Thank you very much.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for the question.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I think that, I was thinking really in terms of that and bridging off of that line of thought explicitly in how technology, or how your practice is driven by technology and how technology drives your practice. And I think explicitly, like within discrete systems such as binary core logic and the way that computers work, they're discrete systems of on or off, as you were saying. And then it makes me think more so about, integer-based programming or hexadecimal-based programming, and expanding and really questioning the foundational basis for what we consider computer logic and alternative forms of computation, including signal-based processing, which is not, binary driven, but rather spectrally driven through filtering and processes. So, I mean, I guess to put that into a question, how does that play a role in your thinking, or are you mostly engaged in the questioning of the discrete with the binary systems, or are you considering branching into these other areas of logical exploration, if I can say it that way?
Yeah, I had in 2019, which feels like a million years ago, I had the opportunity to do a residency at Signal Culture, which at the time was in New York State. And it's, this residency where they have just a huge analog video and sound studio. And part of that really, it was the first time that I had really done something with like a patch and really gotten into that kind of signal logic. And it's not something that I have had an opportunity to engage with since, but it is definitely, I think that gets to this idea of like digital material specificity that I'm interested in, right? Is that like, there are certain things that these more like binary logical codes are good at. There are certain things that JavaScript, HTML, CSS that they want to do, right? And there are ways that they want to work. And if you work with them in like within the language and not just try to break out from it, there are certain types of forms will be produced. And I think the same can be said about like an analog signal. There's like I don't know if you would call it, I would call it maybe like a warmth to that, that's more inherent. Like there's something about it that I find more mysterious in a really kind of beautiful way that I do want to explore, but I haven't yet. But I do see it as like, you know, it wouldn't be, let's translate this thing that I'm doing in this kind of code to this other signal, but rather like, let's honor, like you said, the inherent logic of reading a signal, a spectrum of a signal, and like how that is like that creates fundamentally different forms. And how just the idea of like building a patch is different than say building a script. And what are the things that those things want to create? And then how can I work within that? So not yet, but I want to. If that's
Yeah, absolutely, because it addresses sort of the inherent politic, I think, of technology that you're really, you know, on the upper level. That's where you're really engaging with deeply. So anyway.
Yeah, and as Rhonda put in the chat, even just the idea of quantum computing, right? Which is to say that there is actually a way to think about a variable between 0 and 1 within electrical presence, and how that is going to totally, you know, completely change the way that computation works. And even within that, I was hearing that that within a quantum computing system, it's not actually good at just counting like up to a certain number, but it's incredibly good at factoring prime numbers. So like even within that, there are things about those systems that are like, what is it inherently good at? What is the will of the material really? And then how can I work with the will of the material to like do something interesting and conscientious, maybe is another way to put it.
And if I might, a question that I had is actually kind of like dovetails with something that Lucia put into the chat. So this idea of like legibility versus exactitude, right? And I love that Borges kind of like the idea that the one-to-one map is unmanageable, right? Like if you are too accurate, too true to the kind of landscape, then it becomes useless. It's still too complex and too unknowable. Lucia is asking about, very similarly, I'm really attracted to the lines of questions you asked throughout your work. One question that struck me along these lines, paraphrasing, is it better to be seen incorrectly or not be seen at all? And then she goes on to quote Ocean Vuong, who's equating being seen with being haunted. And I wonder how Vuong's words resonate with you. Absolutely fascinating talk. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I mean, that is the reason I lead with those questions, is because they're the ones that I have the hardest time answering for myself. And really also, this gets a little bit back to Craig's question, in my mentorship of other trans people too. I'm at a weird point where and I've been publicly out and making work as trans for a decade now. And so I often find myself talking with younger trans folks who are navigating earlier parts of that process. And it really, you know, this question really boils down both to the theoretical things that I'm thinking about in my work, and specifically related to AI and facial recognition, but then also just on like a visceral sense of like, you know, when is it useful to be visible as trans, and when is it useful to be able to disappear? And there's, you know, power and there's privilege in that, in being able to pass in a certain way in a certain context. And those things have also changed over Zoom, right? So I've found a pathway for myself in life that allows me to explore these ideas in a relatively public way. But I find myself constantly aware of my body in the work. Previously, I used to make work where my body would be much more explicitly present. And one of the problems with that is that trans bodies in popular culture are often used as a form. They're fascinating, right? They're a thing that people look at in a way that is not necessarily good. It's sometimes much more like the circus freak sort of realm, right? That we're not seen fully as humans, but rather as curiosities. When I first started transitioning back in 2009 rather, you know, if you looked up online anything about trans folks, what you would find is Maury Povich and I can't remember the name of the other like 90s, you know, daytime television people, right? And these sort of fascinating, quote unquote, fascinating like pieces that were really about, look at how odd and strange this person is. And I think a lot of that, honestly, frankly, still exists. And so my work really resists that. So as much as I want to be in my work and show up in my work physically, I'm also constantly mediating that, having to think about the way that my body is visualized in public. And so I think this idea of being seen versus being haunted, or those two things being the same, is really, that does resonate with me. Last year for Trans Day of Visibility, I wrote a short piece on my website that talked about being really, really tired of watching people watch me, and being able to predict the reactions of other folks and predict the ways in which I would be seen. And that being released from that being kind of haunted by the anticipation of how people will view my body, is something that is really present in my daily life and in my work.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I hope we have a transcript to this, because there's like a lot. I wasn't writing that. I'm like, oh my God, there's some little gems in there that I need to think about. Thank you, Chelsea.
Yeah, thanks for the question.
I don't know how much more time everyone has. I want to be cognizant of bandwidth.
If there are more questions, I'm happy to answer them. So
I'd like to follow up. I'd like to follow up, but I also want to make space for the students for whom this is actually, yeah. Maybe just one more question that kind of like, I think skirts also around this notion of exactitude, legibility, and kind of like governability, right? You were in your, and it does dovetail a little bit with that kind of the discussion about being seen in the ways in which you're seen, and is it a good thing or a bad thing to be seen? In that piece, that hypercut piece that you did, where people are kind of like uttering like the word, right? Like, and kind of performing a relationship to that word. There's some, you talk about being texted upon. Is that the way, is that what you do? Can you kind of parse out the ways that you think about like language in relationship to your practice? Because it is obviously such a, an embedded and incorporated part of it, and like the way that you, maybe just the way that you think about language operating in your work.
Yeah. So that idea of, just to first unpack that idea of like being texted upon is, it's this idea that like, as a trans person, I'm like constantly inundated with news articles and other things that purport to speak to or have knowledge on my embodied experience, right? Or make commentary about my fitness for, say, admission into certain public spaces, right? Or my ability to make choices for myself, or my relative danger to other members of society. And so that is where that comes from, this being present to watch yourself be talked about, even in an abstract way. And I think that is actually, that becomes a big part of why there is so much text in my work, and why I write about my work. For a while, I didn't really understand the two things as together, much like when I first started making art, I didn't really think about technology as a space that I could be making from. And it wasn't until probably around 2014 that I really started to think that, oh, this interest I have in technology can also actually be in the studio. And the same thing started to happen with text, where I started to think about, I actually do have a passion for writing, and I have a drive to write in the studio, in my sketchbook, and in the things that I'm making, and that those things don't actually have to have like these silos, just like the silos in making the work. And so that's why when I talk about like the Transcode Manifesto and the way that it gets revised, sometimes those revisions stem from a writing practice, and sometimes they stem from the practice of physically making something in the studio and allowing that to then go back and inform text. So for me, I really do start to see it as, and now even more than before, I also see it as an extension of the writing of code, in this gesture of writing across multiple formats, across multiple mediums, with many different outputs. I think that this becomes a way for me to articulate some of the important bits, the questions that I have, that can really help to anchor some of maybe the more abstract or more just visually fascinating things that are happening. Because as much as I really love the way that like you picked up on this idea of like them performing the relationship to that word, right? I can't always rely as a trans person on non-trans people understanding like why I'm bringing a certain visual reference to bear in a work. And so the text is in some ways a way of grounding some of that, while also through this nonlinear form thing, a way to still resist just giving them like a very like clear, you should think this about this thing, if that makes sense. I don't know if that totally answers your question.
I think it did. Yeah, beautifully. Thank you.
Mhm.
With that, unless there is anything else we should consider today, I know it's final, like everyone's super busy, so I wanna thank you so much, Chelsea, and thank you for letting me introduce you and kind of guide some of the questioning here at the end. Thank you everyone for your amazing questions, Craig, and our now departed colleague, Andrew. And thank you especially to Cynthia and the gallery team for putting these things on. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me and for introducing me. It was really wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Bye.
Chelsea.